I want to welcome you. I'm Julian Ford from the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. And with a wonderful group of colleagues, we're going to talk for the next hour and a half about a trauma-informed approach for newcomer immigrant youth in juvenile justice proceedings. And I think whether you're working in the juvenile justice system, whether you're a mental health provider, or a pediatrician, a nurse, a social worker, a judge, a juvenile probation officer, a juvenile detention officer or administrator, I think you'll find this to be quite valuable. We have from the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, which is part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, we have Dr. Maureen Allwood, Dr. Carly Bates, and Ms. Neha Desai. And Ms. Desai is an attorney who also is a senior attorney at the National Center for Youth Law, which she is representing. And from the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center in the National Child Traumatic Stress Center, we have Dr. Emma Cardelli and Dr. Alsab Issa. So those are our panelists, and let's go to the next slide. In this webinar, we're going to talk about who are the immigrant children and families that we're all working with. And we're going to focus on adolescent brain development and take a look at how the Supreme Court and its jurisprudence has understood and has been dealing with adolescent brain development, which is of crucial importance. We'll also look at different types of trauma, the enduring effects of trauma, what it's like for youth and family members who are immigrating and have dealt with or are dealing with trauma to be living in survival mode, and how that plays out in the form of traumatic stress, which can then lead youth to become involved in the juvenile justice system, and it makes it crucial for all of us who are working with those youth and their families to understand the impact of trauma. We'll also talk about the resilience of youth and cultural considerations, which are so crucial when we're talking about youth who are immigrants themselves or whose families are immigrants or both. And we'll look at legal implications of juvenile adjudication on immigration release. So some really crucial legal issues for both attorney colleagues, but also for those of us in the health services field. As we do that, we'll be talking through a real-life case study, not a single boy, but a young man who's a composite of many youth who are in this position of entering this country or having their families having entered this country, whether it's days, weeks, months, or years ago. We'll look at how this has played out in the life of Mateo. And we'll also talk about the role of court professionals and really focus in on what can the juvenile justice system do and what can we all do as part of that. So let's go on to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Julian. This is Neha Desai speaking now. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about who immigrant children are, or children in immigrant families broadly. So this is an incredibly diverse group that encompasses children in a variety of legal statuses. And I'm sure, as you all know, simply because a child is in an immigrant family does not mean that the child or the child's family is necessarily undocumented. So immigrants are often thought of or characterized as either documented and undocumented, but in fact it's far more complex than that. And as is illustrated on this slide, a child may be a citizen or a non-citizen, but non-citizen children may have temporary protected status that will never lead to citizenship. So DACA is an example of that. A child may have a temporary status that will lead to permanent status. So lawful permanent resident is an example of that as well. And of course, a child may not have any status at all. And for those children that are living in immigrant families and have status, many of these children are living with family members who do not have status. So there is an incredibly complex array of statuses that comprise the category of children in immigrant families. Next slide, please. So this group, as many of you probably know, is the fastest group of American children in entirety. A staggering 25% of U.S. children live in an immigrant family, and of those, 4.5 million live with at least one parent that's undocumented. So these are children that are living in daily fear of having a family member deported. This, of course, has profound implications for their mental health and for the well-being of these children. Next slide. Thank you. You can go ahead and put up all three of the bubbles here. Thank you. So while the population overall of children in immigrant families is extremely large, for purposes of today's presentation and the primer that we've developed, what we've really focused on is a smaller subset of immigrant children, a subset we refer to as newcomer immigrant youth. And this subset includes refugee children, asylum-seeking children, and unaccompanied children. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just unpacking what the distinctions here are, because there is some significant overlap amongst these three and a lot of unifying themes in their trauma histories, which we will be discussing in much greater detail throughout. So the definition of a refugee is based in international law, and a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to his or her home country and cannot obtain a protection in that country due to past persecution or well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So that international law definition was incorporated into U.S. domestic law in 1980, in the Refugee Act of 1980. So both international and domestic law define refugees in the way that I just explained. And the primary distinction between refugees and asylum seekers are their status when they arrive. So a refugee has gained this designation as a refugee in their home country before they flee and come to the arriving country. So a refugee child that arrives at the United States is entering the United States with some temporary legal status as a refugee. And asylum is a protection granted to foreign nationals already in the United States or at the border who meet that exact same definition that I just read of a refugee. So it is completely lawful for a child, for a family, to come to the border without any status and seek protection as a refugee. This again is enshrined in international and domestic law. And so when we have children arriving and families arriving at the border seeking asylum status, they are doing so lawfully, but they're entering the country without existing lawful status. An unaccompanied child is a child who arrives at the border with no lawful status, someone who is under 18, and at the point at which they arrive, they have no parent or legal guardian with them able to care and provide physical custody. Now, the application of this term is a little bit complex because some of these children enter here unaccompanied, meaning they arrive at the border without a parent or legal guardian, but they actually do have someone within the United States to whom they can be released after they are in federal immigration custody. So they might ultimately be released to a parent, but when they first arrive, they are not arriving with a parent. These children face a distinctive set of challenges, some of which we'll touch on throughout this presentation. All right, next slide.
Hi everyone, so this is Carly Bates. I'm just going to talk for a moment about adolescent brain development. So newcomer immigrant youth who are appearing in juvenile justice cases are typically somewhere in early to late adolescence. And as we know from decades of research, we know that youth at this stage of development are undergoing a lot of change in many different areas, including physical changes, social changes, and cognitive changes. And one significant area of change and maturation that's happening during this stage of development is in the brain. So although there's sometimes a tendency in the justice system to view adolescents, and particularly older adolescents, as mini adults, there are significant differences between the teenage brain and the adult brain, particularly in the areas of problem solving, decision making, and reactions when confronting stress and danger. So go ahead to the next slide. So I just want to highlight a few of the key differences between the adolescent brain and the adult brain, particularly because some of these differences are frequently related to behaviors that may bring youth to the attention of the juvenile justice system. So one key area of the brain that's underdeveloped and is continuing to develop even into young adulthood is the prefrontal cortex, and that is the area of our brain responsible for executive functioning, such as planning, thinking through consequences, long-term thinking, and appreciating risk. So while teenagers are developing these abilities, they're not quite in the same place as an adult is. And at the same time that this is happening, there are changes in other areas of the brain make adolescents much more prone to risk-taking and more susceptible to increased reward-seeking. And in addition, as peers become a much more central focus for teenagers, they move away from family and peers become, very important. Teenagers are also more easily influenced by their peers. And this is all normative. All of us can probably think of times in adolescence when we took risks and we may have done things that we would never consider doing now as adults. In addition to these pieces, there's also much more reliance in adolescence on the areas of the brain that may be more developed that are associated with emotion, and less efficient pathways and less reliable pathways of connection between the different areas. So that results in inconsistency between thoughts and feelings and actions. So if you put this all together, you have increased risk-taking, much more reliance on the emotion centers of the brain, and underdeveloped abilities to think through consequences, take a step back, and plan, and a more immature ability to self-regulate, so that's still developing. So it's like teenagers are, driving fast cars, but with very limited and inconsistent access to the brakes. And these are things that all adolescents are confronting in this stage of development. But this process of development is even further complicated by trauma. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in a moment. But many of these important changes and developments that are helping youth to mature and gain more control and increase their ability to effectively self-regulate may be even more delayed because for a youth who's been through trauma, and particularly chronic trauma and ongoing trauma, the brain may be primarily focused on survival. So all of those changes in development in the brain may be delayed for youth who've been through trauma. Right, go to the next slide.
Okay. So the research that Carly just outlined has really had a profound, truly transformational impact on court decisions impacting juveniles. So in 2005, in Roper v. Simmons, the Supreme Court held that the Eighth Amendment prohibits the death penalty for all juvenile offenders under the age of 18. And that decision was based in large part and cited extensively the research that Carly just spoke about. And then building on that decision in 2010, Granby, Florida, the Supreme Court held that the Eighth Amendment also prohibits a sentence of life without the possibility of parole for a child who committed a non-homicide offense. And then moving to 2012 in Miller v. Alabama, the Supreme Court built even further, holding that mandatory sentences of life without the possibility of parole are unconstitutional for juvenile offenders. And in the slide here, you have some examples directly from the decision on the type of research that was cited to come to this conclusion. So why is this relevant to today's conversation? What we are really hoping is that the rich research emerging around child trauma will increasingly inform how children, and for purposes of today's conversation, newcomer immigrant children, are addressed throughout the court system. So the example of how adolescent development research has really penetrated the law, I find to be a powerful and hopeful example of the synergy that's possible between research and law.
So we're going to be talking about traumatic experiences that are common and more specific to newcomer immigrant youth. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a step back for a moment to just touch on and talk about what we mean when we say trauma. So what you see here on the slide is the clinical definition of trauma. This comes from the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is what mental health clinicians use to make diagnoses. And this definition is part of the criteria for diagnosing an individual with post-traumatic stress disorder. So the clinical definition of trauma is actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence And that may involve something that an individual experiences themselves directly, witnesses happening to someone else, as well as repeated or extreme exposure to the details of traumatic events. So an example here might be a first responder or mental health professional who's hearing day in, day out, working with trauma survivors, the details of what other people have experienced in their lives, which we often talk about, refer to as secondary trauma. And finally, for kids who are 0 to 6 years old, even hearing about a traumatic event that may have happened to a caregiver can constitute trauma. And I just want to, point out a couple of things. There may also be other experiences that people have, and you'll hear about some of those as we talk about the experiences common for newcomer immigrant youth that may not necessarily fit within this narrow definition, but may still be traumatic for that particular individual. So things like discrimination and racism, bullying, and even historical trauma. And also, it's important to note that not all people who experience trauma go on to experience long-lasting effects of trauma. There is a compounding effect to trauma, so the more that a person has experienced, the greater the likelihood may be of long-lasting impact. So now we're going to hear about Mateo.
Yeah, so let me introduce you all to Mateo, who we will follow through as we talk about all these issues. And based on this foundation, I can tell you that Mateo is a pre-teenager who has an adolescent brain. He is the member of a family that has been involved in immigration, and he's experienced most, if not all, of the forms of trauma that Dr. Bates just talked about. Mateo is 12 years old. He was born in Honduras. We're going to follow Mateo through his migration journey, including his arrival to the United States, and learn about his life in this country. What we want to begin with is Mateo he's just a regular kid in a lot of ways, and a really healthy, resilient kid. He likes playing soccer with his friends, and he likes drawing pictures. He's good at math, and he enjoys spotting the different kinds of birds that live in the trees around his neighborhood. So he's a budding ornithologist. Mateo feels close to his younger sister and to some of his friends at school. So there's a lot that is good that's going for Mateo in spite of the challenges he faces. And by the way, let me just parenthetically note, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, and I see one of our audience members has already done that, you can do that in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And yes, we will provide you with a way to have access to these slides. So thank you for that question. And let's go on.
Here's a type of trauma. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
All set.
So newcomer children experience multiple traumas caused with migration pathways, such as immigration, during migration, detention and separation time, and then also the post-migration. And I will go on to talk about each phase. Next slide, please. In the pre-migration, children face direct exposure to violence or witness all types of violence and threats to survival, such as war and conflict. Some are separated from their families due to the war, and also other conflict, lack of food, water, and just really basic necessities. We all know that in order for kids to succeed and do well, that they need to meet these basic necessities such as education, access to healthcare, and food sources. Kids are also separated from their families, and they are forced to join gang activities, and often they have the choice to either join or being killed. And traumatic grief related to death of a caregiver and other important persons, things like their loved ones being killed, or getting raped or torture. And then they also experience other violence, such as domestic violence, whether it's within the household or in the community, and extreme poverty. I think one of the reasons that they're often fleeing is because of all these really stressors. Next slide, please. And then during migration, there are a number of risk factors continue. Not sure. I don't think it is the right slide. Where
Looks like Dr. Ford is on mute.
Sorry. Mateo and his family migrated. When Mateo was growing up in Honduras, he went to school for 2 years. And then, tragically, his mother was murdered by his stepfather when he was 7 years old. He and his little sister went to live with his grandmother, but she forced them to sell food on the streets instead of going to school. Mateo's grandmother routinely abused him and threatened to send him away if he didn't make enough money. Mateo also suffered so as a result, he suffered from physical abuse, emotional abuse, and he also experienced sexual abuse while working in the streets. When he was 12, his stepfather escaped from prison and threatened to kill him and his little sister. So now additional violence in Mateo and his family's lives. Mateo fled from the Honduras, taking his 8-year-old sister with him, hoping they could find one relative he knew was in the United States, their aunt in South Carolina. And let's go on.
And during migration, some of these stressors really continue in the kids' and families' lives. Transition to new resident, children often experience additional traumas involved in abuse, exploitation, and violence, both as a victim and the witness.
And you can see how, from this list of many different types of trauma, Mateo and his little sister have experienced many, if not all of these. He and his little sister fled Honduras on foot, and they slowly made their way to the southern border of the United States, which is a grueling journey. They slept outside, finding shelter under bridges or low bushes along the side of the road. Mateo would often go hungry in order to make sure that his sister had enough to eat. When we think about the experience that Mateo had, he ended up in a detention center, and in that sort of a center, children are supposed to be screened and interviewed within 48 hours, and if they're unaccompanied, they're supposed to be transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, within 72 hours. But while that's happening, they don't have an adult or even any trusted adult, let alone a parent who can help them through the process. The officers are typically not trained to identify signs of abuse or trauma, and they can be and the interviews that are involved, and just the fear of being sent back or being harmed or being otherwise abused, as occurred in Mateo's life, can be extremely re-traumatizing, even when the officials, the officers, do the very best job that they possibly can. And when they unfortunately resort to verbal or physical or even sexual abuse, that just compounds things. So for Mateo, one of the things he told some adults when he was talking about his experience was people who were detained there called this place the freezer because it's very cold there. I couldn't sleep at night because I was so cold. They gave us silver emergency blankets, but we had to sleep on the floor without mattresses. I wasn't given a change of clothes, and I wasn't allowed to shower. After 3 days, all of a sudden, I was driven 3 hours to a large cage inside a tent. I had no idea what was happening. Let's go on.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Emma Cardelli.
Yes, Emma.
Perfect. Okay, so once detained by Customs and Border Control, unaccompanied children are supposed to be transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, within 72 hours. After transfer, unaccompanied children may be detained for months or even years while they wait to be released to an adult sponsor. These children face both new and familiar challenges in ORR custody, including restricted communication with family, unfamiliar rules and expectations, language barriers, uncertainty, and continued vulnerability to abuse and neglect. These children also typically don't have access to mental health care, despite the fact that studies of detained unaccompanied children in the U.S. have found high rates of PTSD, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and behavioral dysregulation.
So here's a little bit of what Mateo said about that experience, and just a small sampling. Being detained for such a long time made me feel really bad. I never used to have such problems with depression or anxiety, but since I've been detained, I become much more easily frustrated. Being detained makes me feel like I'm going crazy. I'm always alone with my thoughts, and bad memories of things that have happened to me run through my head all day. I don't know how I can improve my mental health if I'm kept in a cage. Let's go on.
Before we start the next slide, I just wanted to let folks know that all of the text that's in quotes is taken directly from children that we've interviewed that are detained in federal immigration custody. So those are really their words directly.
In the post-release period, a lot of really sort of stressors continue under hardship. They can keep youth and their families in the short states of stress and survival, including extreme poverty and discrimination. I think a lot of newcomer children don't often experience, like they do experience discrimination, but probably once they just settle in the U.S., this is the first time they are experiencing it from sort of outsiders. I think often discrimination happens because of their race back in their country, but in here, it might look different. Again, separation from family members really continues, and often some of them are placed in a community that's not so safe. So really this living in a community that's full of violence, or either witnessing their friends being killed because of community violence. And often I think that they are exposed to sort of kids that probably are doing drugs or in gang activities. And then some are just going through cultural shock and really grief of trying to figure out, especially I think after 3 to 5 years, that's when they really are like wondering, like, okay, I was excited life in here, things was going well, but now I'm probably like trying to figure out and navigate all the stressors once they are here.
These stressors aren't always evident. For example, with Mateo and his little sister, they were eventually released from government custody to their aunt Nayeli, who lived in South Carolina with her 2 children. Nayeli's husband had been recently detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and she worked in multiple jobs to support their family. So in many ways, Mateo and his sister were able to find a truly safe haven with their aunt and uncle. And yet, in the background, they were still contending with many of the stressors that Osab just described. Their lives were safer, but they were by no means free from stress, and they'd had no help in dealing with the trauma that they'd experienced up to that point. And let's go on.
Yes, to build off of what Osab and Julian just shared, the post-migration period clearly brings a number of new hardships and continuing dangers for newcomer immigrant youth and families as they attempt to adjust to the norms, customs, and traditions of a new country. In addition to traumatic stress, we commonly see 3 other types of stressors impacting newcomer immigrant youth and their families during the post-migration period, specifically resettlement stressors, acculturation stressors, and isolation stressors. Resettlement stressors are stressors that children and families experience as they try to make a new life for themselves, and may include things like financial hardship, transportation difficulties, housing instability, difficulties finding employment, and lack of access to resources critical to ensuring their basic needs are met. Acculturation stressors are stressors that children and families experience as they try to navigate between their new culture and their culture of origin. This can include problems trying to fit in at school, conflicts between children and parents over new and old cultural values, being unfamiliar with school routines and expectations, and having to consistently translate for family members who are not fluent in English, or to assume other adult responsibilities to support the family system. And finally, isolation stressors, which are stressors that children and families experience as minorities in a new country. This can include a loss of social status and natural supports, feelings of loneliness or not belonging, discrimination, and harassment. Taken together, these core stressors in resettlement can present a multitude of seemingly insurmountable challenges for newcomer immigrant youth on top of all the other traumatic exposures and stressful events they experienced across their migration journey. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Osab, Emma, and Julian for pointing out the types of trauma experiences and the types of stressors that these youth experience. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I want to point out that there's now a really large compilation of studies and also personal narratives and other mediums that show that these experiences have enduring effects. So there's a number of epidemiological studies, including World Health Organization studies, that tie childhood trauma to adult mental health and physical health problems. And so we know that these experiences that happen in childhood can linger, but we also know that they don't just occur in adulthood. So oftentimes we look at adults and their reports of their experiences, but we certainly see the symptoms and the concerns in childhood as well. So the response to trauma varies from person to person, and the types of concerns that linger also vary from person to person. So some of the symptoms might be more prominent for some youth and absent for others. Some of the responses that we commonly see are that, youth who have been exposed to long-term instability, danger, and violence, that they might watch out for danger even when the external danger does not exist. So feeling threatened, feeling unsafe, and looking for danger might be a concern here described as hypervigilance. Also, youth may have intrusive and reoccurring thoughts and memories of the traumatic events. These can appear as images, could be sounds, visceral sensations, and all of the sensory systems might be at play in terms of the input, the triggers that bring back the traumatic memories and the traumatic sensations. And so for some youth, they might talk about sort of reoccurring thoughts and memories, and others, they might be experiencing these as simply images, sounds that come back to them. Which you can imagine that this makes it really difficult to regulate emotions and regulate behaviors. So difficulty regulating emotions can take the form of, negative expression, so extreme anger, anxiety, having emotional outbursts, also feelings of guilt, shame, extreme grief, terror. It can also take the form of what we tend to call overregulation. So for some youth, we might not see sort of this extreme behavioral and emotional dysregulation much of the time. What we might see more often is a really restricted range of affect. So efforts to control emotions more so. So including not feeling the same intensity of happiness and excitement that they once did. Also for some, they might experience feelings of just feeling disengaged and detached from those around them, experience dissociation, and also confusion. Many struggle with difficulty in terms of their sense of self-worth and their value. Traumas that occur in childhood, I think especially for those who have the experiences before they can sort of mentally articulate what has happened, why it has happened, they're having trouble making meaning out of their experiences. For some, what we see is reenactment of the events that they've experienced. So for some youth, what we might see is a reenactment playing out of scenes that occurred in their pre-migration stage or in post-migration. Some of the traumas might seem as if they're sort of incorporating these into their play, with their dolls, with their toys. For older children and adolescents, the reenactments might look less like play or like dramatization. Instead, what we might see are behaviors that might bring them to the attention of the juvenile justice system. We might see violent behaviors. We might see sexualized behaviors. We might see behaviors that people identify as problematic, and in fact, they're sort of perhaps reenacting things that they've been exposed to. One of the most concerning, enduring effects of trauma is the impact that it has on relationships. So youth may disengage from parents and caregivers. They might lose their sense of trust in adults and adults' ability to protect them. They might have difficulty with peer relationships. And again, these difficulty with relationships can lead to, just their access to positive emotions and positive experiences. When the responses to trauma linger, when they endure, youth may begin to live in a way that's what we call survival mode. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But living in survival mode can have its own consequences as well.
So let's talk a little bit about how these enduring effects have affected Mateo. And by the way, I want to acknowledge and encourage our audience members to share with us the comments and questions. Dr. Jimenez Salazar, thank you for your comment, and we will talk about ways in which psychologists can engage in and develop a relationship with the OBP and ORR, CBP and ORR shelter facilities. So thank you very much for that question, and we will make sure to come back to that. But let's go back to Mateo for a moment. He's experiencing many of these after effects of trauma, even though he's living with his aunt and little sister. And so he has a family around him, but not the family that he grew up with, except for his little sister. He had a difficult time adjusting to life in South Carolina for all the reasons that Emma was just describing as well. He had difficulty at sleeping at night, and often had nightmares when he was back, that he was back in the ORR custody, and he couldn't find his sister. One of those really terribly frightening nightmares that can happen for kids because they're so intent on survival, as Maureen was describing. During the day, he constantly felt anxious and became very quiet and withdrawn. So he looks like a kid who can't sleep, who's suddenly anxious and depressed and worried about things more than he should be, in quotation marks, but it's really because he's had so much to worry about and so much to deal with, and he needs some help in recovering from those after effects. At school, his limited English made navigating his academic classes at times just feel very overwhelming, as it would for any kid. He also struggled socially, and tragically some other students picked on him and bullied him very often, telling him to go back to his own country and shoving him into the lockers between classes. As his anxiety increased, Mateo found that one of the only ways he could find some kind of relief was by smoking marijuana before going to school. So you can see how the problems are beginning to add up, and it's not because of something wrong with Mateo, it's because some things have happened that have been very traumatic for Mateo. Let's continue.
Thank you. So as illustrated in by Mateo's story, when normal adolescent brain development is coupled with these traumatic events, living in survival mode can really become the norm and can also decrease functioning in many key areas. So in survival mode, the brain is really focused on just that, surviving, which means scanning the environment for threats, rapidly and instinctively reacting to perceived threats. And perceived threats could be, very simple and benign responses from the environment. So a smirk on someone's face, a word, a phrase, a sensation that develops, being in a place that is a reminder of a place that was, problematic before. So this is like living with a broken alarm system where the bells are always ringing and saying you're in danger, and you have to react. In survival mode, youth are really susceptible to anger, irritability, impulsivity, and this could also, as I mentioned before, sort of exhibit itself as shutting down, being detached, being separate from, and also extreme avoidance, including avoidance of people and isolation. The difficulty with regulating emotions and needing to avoid trauma, could make youth more susceptible to addictive behaviors. There's certainly now a number of studies that talk about the vulnerability of youth and their experiences of trauma, how they might become more vulnerable to particularly marijuana use, that sort of air quotes, help to manage the emotions, and also alcohol use, which might be used to avoid the emotional experiences. In survival mode, reaction to perceived threat is prioritized over self-control, which interferes with the youth, their ability to sort of draw on their own strengths, to look at their internal motivation, to manage distress, and to think effectively. So living in survival mode really affects behaviors, it affects cognitions, it affects emotional regulation, and as alluded to earlier, it affects the relationships, particularly the supportive relationships that could be helpful with healing. So what does the, next slide please, thank you. So what does it look like when youth are functioning in survival mode? This certainly can bring them to the attention of the court system. And I think the takeaway message here is that traumatized youth in survival mode can be quite impulsive. Responding in a fight or flight or even a freeze manner. They can fail to stop and think before they take action. In survival mode, youth who fail to use sort of sound problem-solving and decision-making skills. And again, we're talking about, we know that's already a challenge maybe during the adolescent period, but with trauma experiences, even more challenging. So they might make decisions that's not really based on full awareness and a thorough evaluation of the consequences that those actions might come to. Traumatized youth in survival mode may not exhibit sort of age-appropriate level of pro-social judgment and social responsibility. Also, the protective factors that are usually at play with helping adolescents who are challenged with, consequential thinking might not be easily accessible to youth in survival mode and youth with trauma experiences. So when youth are functioning in survival mode, you might have a support system, parents, other trusted adults, able to provide them with external support and external protective factors. But for newcomer immigrant youth, these caregivers and elders might not be available to them, or they themselves might have also experienced trauma and not have this consequential thinking sort of accessible to them as well. Let's see, so let me just highlight that for traumatized youth, we have to really think about the protective factors, safety, guidance, support, the positive structures that are needed in order to shift their brains and their behaviors from survival mode to resiliency and healing and to develop self-control. Next slide.
So for Mateo, living in survival mode took many of these forms. He felt incredibly lonely. He had a hard time making friends because other kids called him names, as well as the bullying. But there was one girl who was nice to him. And yet he felt embarrassed and didn't want other kids to be mean to her, so he acted like he didn't want to be friends with her, even though he really wanted a friend and he thought she was nice. So here we have a kid who's prioritizing survival, as Maureen just described, over developing a friendship even when he had the opportunity. But it wasn't because he didn't want to be social or didn't want to have friends or he couldn't be a good friend. It was because he was actually trying to protect this little girl. One day as Mateo was walking home from school, a group of boys followed him and beat him up, leaving him with a broken nose and bloodied face. The boys told Mateo that if he ever came back to school, they would hurt him again. So talk about additional trauma. And in this case, trauma that's based upon race, culture, language, ethnicity, all the factors that Mateo has no control over and that make him vulnerable, even though they should actually be a mark of pride and respect. The next day, Mateo went back to school because he's a courageous guy. And the boys taunted him in the hallways, making a fun of his bruises and saying that he was weak, when actually he was quite strong. After lunch, one of the boys followed Mateo into the bathroom. This really terrified Mateo, and he lashed out, punching and kicking the other boy as hard as he could. And that's aggression to protect himself, not to hurt the other kid. And this is aggression after he's been so terribly aggressed against. And yet when the school called the police, the officer that searched Mateo's locker found a gram of marijuana, and now it was Mateo who was in deep trouble. Let's go on.
Thanks. In terms of youth functioning in survival mode and their experience with the court process, one of the things to consider is that what has been described in terms of behaviors and experiences are also at play if you come into contact with law enforcement and the courts. They may exhibit behaviors in that court process in which it's difficult for those who are not familiar with youth, who are newcomer immigrants and are highly traumatized. They might not be familiar with the behaviors, and this can be misinterpreted. So youth who are hypersensitive and hyperreactive to perceived threat may appear to be uncooperative, defiant, callous. They may appear to be unresponsive and disengaged in the process. And for some, they may appear to be unappreciative. So when recommendations are made or help is offered, certainly could be misperceived that they're not in appreciation of that because of the enduring effects that we talked about earlier. So it's essential that everyone in the court process consider whether traumatic stress may be the driver of how youth present or how they're perceived, as well as how their family members might be perceived. Newcomer immigrant youth may also be struggling with language barriers. The youth and their families may have different cultural perspectives about the legal system and the recommended services that are offered to them. So one common example are things like missing appointments or showing up late for appointments. And so certainly in U.S. culture, that is considered respectful to show up when an appointment has been made, but that's not always consistent with other cultures. So there could be different cultural norms at play. There could be the avoidance that's associated with the traumas that are at play. And so these are things to consider. Court evaluators and other court personnel should also consider signs such as mistrust, like refusing to work with the court professionals, not answering the door, not returning calls. They should consider aggressive behaviors and whether this is also tied to the traumas that have been experienced. Substance use, academic failure, failure to attend school, difficulty focusing on concentrating when they do attend school, or appearing to be checked out or disengaged and disinterested. Also, leaving placement, wanting to, sometimes we think that the placements that are offered should be appreciated, but there could be things that are culturally inconsistent. And so leaving a placement, these are things that we have to consider in terms of the trauma exposure as well.
And just building upon the examples that Maureen just gave, in addition to the court process, there are also trauma triggers everywhere within all of the different areas of the juvenile justice system. So there are multiple ways that newcomer immigrant youth might be facing or experiencing things that remind them of the difficult experiences that they've had. It can be, experiences they've had in pre-migration, during migration, and also post-migration and during resettlement. And newcomer immigrant youth may be particularly vulnerable to being taken advantage of in the system and further re-traumatization. And each additional traumatic experience has the potential to increase the risk for negative outcomes. So just sort of highlighting a few additional examples, and as I'm going through these examples, I'm thinking also specifically about secure juvenile justice facilities where some of these things are very prevalent. So one example is touch. So being touched, if we think about Mateo, we know that he has a history of physical abuse and sexual abuse. And so being touched can be an instant reminder for him of those experiences that he's had. And touch is constant, particularly in detention. And, youth might be touched or shackled or handcuffed by court officers or corrections officers, and also being searched. That feels like such a violation of physical space, but also being searched and having your possessions taken. That could be a reminder of what a youth has experienced in their home country or maybe in a refugee camp. And a youth may have one or two possessions, and taking those away can be extremely traumatic for them. And being questioned, particularly when not in their native language and in this very unfamiliar and foreign system. Being separated from family and or community. So when kids are in juvenile detention facilities, by their very nature, they are not with their families or their communities. And this can trigger feelings of abandonment, fear. So, kids, newcomer immigrant youth in particular, may be living in fear, as Neha mentioned earlier, of a family member being deported or a family member being in immediate danger, and they're in a facility and not able to feel like they can protect that family member. And we know from Mateo's story that he's very close with his sister, and that his journey to this country, the two of them made that journey together, and so he may feel a certain sense of being her protector, and now he's not with her. And loss of control is, inherent in the juvenile justice system. Kids going through the system don't have any control over what's happening to them, and that's also inherent in trauma. And having a lack of voice in the process. The court system, the juvenile justice system is confusing for everyone, but it's a completely foreign system for many newcomer immigrant youth. And they may literally not have a voice in the process, particularly if they don't speak the language. And then thinking about, again, detention, this isn't listed here, but locking in and bedtime are also incredibly triggering times for kids who've been through a lot of trauma. And for Mateo, we think about, when he was migrating here, he was sleeping next to his sister. They were sleeping in various different places. And so for him, locking in at bedtime, being alone in the dark, may remind him of scary experiences that he's had, and not having sort of that sense of safety or comfort. And, being triggered and re-traumatized, can lead for kids to an increase and exacerbation in traumatic stress symptoms that Maureen talked about earlier. And these may be seen as defiant or aggressive, by the players in the system, corrections officers, court officers, when really they're manifestations of survival mode and youth reacting in fight, flight, or freeze. And aggressively responding to a youth who's in survival mode makes things worse for that youth and further decreases their sense of safety. So we can't necessarily avoid all triggers in the system, but I think by recognizing them and trying to kind of see where individual youth might be coming from and seeing them as potential trauma triggers, players in the system might be able to do a better job of doing things a little bit differently.
So let's look at what this has meant for Mateo. And I want to highlight, in addition to the examples that Carly and Maureen have given us, Dr. Jimenez Salazar also mentioned, it's in a comment, a very, very apt example. Cultural norms and legal standards can vary so drastically from country to country and region and place to place. And for example, a 16-year-old who might be treated as an adult in one country, Cuba for example, in this country is going to be treated as a minor, and that could be incredibly confusing. It also disempowers that young man or young woman, and that's exactly the kind of confusion that, when, if not recognized, we expect that youth understand exactly the rules and the norms where they're living, but if they're not provided with guidance and assistance in understanding those norms and support in doing so, then they're really left in a quandary. And for Mateo, he went through the several stages of the juvenile justice system. He was adjudicated as delinquent and placed in a secure facility for 30 days. So now he's back in detention again, and we know how he felt about detention through the immigration process. So this is bringing him right back to many of the same kinds of stressors and trauma reminders and some of the same exact triggers that Carly and Maureen just talked about. So while in detention, not surprisingly, his mental health deteriorated dramatically. He was constantly worried about his little sister, so it wasn't just that the conditions were difficult or that he was being subjected to reminders or even to incredibly stressful experiences and some traumatic threats as well, but he was also still worried about his little sister, and he really wanted to be able to protect her. The staff used physical restraints, and they often, in fact, routinely used strip searches, and this just triggered memories not just of the detention in the past, but of the physical and sexual abuse that he'd experienced back in his home country. So Mateo said, the anger that I feel is that I am asking staff here at the detention center and at the placements I've been before to give me the tools to help me through this intense anxiety, through this PTSD and the pain I'm feeling, but they don't provide them. I want a pen, just a pen, to write about my feelings. Sometimes I want time alone, and they make me stick to a schedule. Sometimes I need to walk around, and they make me stay in my room. They just don't allow me the tools to get better, and that's the dilemma. But let's go on and look at how resilient these youth are.
Thank you. So the fact that a newcomer immigrant youth has experienced trauma and may be operating in survival mode does not mean that they are damaged or broken. There are so many ways to help youth, even those who've been through unimaginable experiences, heal and build skills for helping to increase their ability to manage distress. And this is really where resilience comes in. So resilience is the ability to think and act with self-control under conditions of significant adversity. And I like to think of resilience as the ability to bounce back. And resilience and self-control are developed through the influence of protective factors. So the best way to begin building resilience is to start by tapping into a youth's strengths, their existing strengths, and the strengths of their communities and their families, and to harness those protective factors. And every youth has a strength to build from. So this slide sort of details some of the common protective factors, and it's broken up into internal, so individual protective factors, and external factors. I'm just going to highlight a few of these. So self-esteem, helping youth to build their self-esteem and their sense of worthiness, and also competence, helping them to feel like there is something that they are good at, and helping them to build on that. Helping kids to, or finding out from kids, what parts of their culture, specific parts of their culture that they identify with that are important to them. And this is different for different youth and for different families. So it's important, I think, to really ask youth what's important to them in terms of their culture and how can you build upon that. And similarly, what is important to them in terms of their own values, their own goals, what they might see for their future. And faith as well, so connection maybe to spirituality or to religion. And again, this is different for different cultures, but also for different families and individuals. So it's important to really be able to ask the kids and families what they connect with, what helps them get through the day, what helps them to build resilience. And then on the external side, thinking about social support. So social support in the literature has been identified time and time again as a very, very important protective factor. So having positive, meaningful social support from others is very protective, as well as having secure relationships with caregivers. And with regard to school, connectedness to school, or maybe, we heard from Mateo that he's having struggles in school, but maybe there's something outside of school, such as some sort of community connection or a place that he can go where he feels connected. Those things are very important. and helping kids to develop positive peer relationships and increase the ability for them to sort of feel like they belong somewhere. We know from the research that feeling isolated and feeling like you don't belong are risk factors for depression, but also for gang involvement. So it's really important to help youth find ways to connect and gain and get positive and meaningful support so they don't feel like they're alone. And it's very important also to engage the youth themselves in the process of finding out what that means for them. Next slide.
Mateo, this really was a very difficult transition. As his time in secure confinement continued, he felt himself withdrawing further and further. When he was allowed to use the phone, Mateo called his little sister, who told him that she missed him and hoped she would see him soon. And that really boosted Mateo's spirits, but it also made him feel very sad. The juvenile justice facility only offered a few hours of schooling each day, and Mateo had trouble following the teacher due to his limited English. So he was still feeling very challenged and very alone. To pass the time, he focused on drawing pictures. So here's where kids draw on their strengths, as Maureen talked about, and he found one that seems very simple, but it's so crucial. He sketched all day. His home in Honduras, other children in the juvenile hall, cartoons of names, and he would often give his drawings away to others. Mateo was surprised that some of the youth actually said nice things to him about his drawings, and that one of the staff actually told him he should go to art school because he was really talented. This finally gave Mateo a feeling of pride, and he started to feel just a little bit less lonely and worried. Turning a corner is exactly the crucial thing that could happen. And it was just from this small opportunity that was so big for Mateo and the small recognition which meant so much to Mateo. Let's go on.
We discussed the impact of trauma in their lives, in these kids' lives, these newcomers. But it's also important to consider the role of culture. Newcomer immigrant youth and families have a unique and different cultural features. Cultural relationship traditions and identity play a crucial role in supporting youth's resilience, self-esteem, and social judgment and behaviors. So, for example, I think you could, when working with these kids, you could kind of consider sort of their history of towards the government or people in power. As we talked about earlier, I think that many of these kids have fear toward the government or just trusting people in power because often those individuals has taken advantage of them in their native country. Also consider understanding the stigma or lack of understanding of mental health. So how is mental health defined in their native culture or in their culture? I think if we understand where the problem is coming from, then we can help them sort of shape the solution. And also when we're working with children, we might not be sort of considering the whole family and the caregivers, but kids are considering sort of they know what's going on, the stressors that's happening in their family, so the legal status of the caregivers. So for example, if a caregiver does not have a legal status in the country, that might be an additional stressor to the children. Unlike if we're working with like an American-born child, he or she might not be sort of worrying about what's happening in the family, right? Because I think and the providers might not even consider what the family needs. But I think it's important to consider sort of the whole family. And then I think there are not enough sort of mental health evaluational tools that are considering the needs of these kids that we work with. So one possible, if you cannot find, I don't know, if either evaluational tools to provide to these kids, but consulting with someone that is familiar with their culture, whether that is a cultural broker or interpreter, or someone that sort of can help you shape the work that you're doing with the child.
So Mateo's aunt Nayeli was a devout Christian and expected her children to connect with the Christian faith in a similar manner, which has many advantages, but it's also not necessarily going to be what they've experienced or what they are seeking. In his aunt's eyes, Mateo was expected to attend church 3 times a week, pray before meals and each night, and take care of the younger children in the house. When Mateo was first released from custody, he obeyed and listened to his aunt. However, he began to struggle to meet all of her expectations when he noticed that his American peers were living very differently. In order to avoid conflict and find ways to fit in while still dealing and managing things with his aunt, he spent more and more time away from home. His grades dropped and he became withdrawn and depressed. So again, another set of stressors for Mateo to deal with, this time trying to integrate into the community while also being a member of a family that has different practices, beliefs, and expectations. Aunt Nayeli didn't reach out to others for support, such as a counselor or therapist, because she'd never known anyone that had used those kinds of support services, and she didn't know what they would entail or even how to access them. She felt overwhelmed with working 3 jobs, understandably, taking care of 4 children, including 2 newcomers, and trying to find an affordable immigration lawyer from her husband. That's an enormous amount on Aunt Nayeli's plate. She was also deeply afraid of engaging with any public systems that could put her family at risk of deportation, just as Neha has described. So what a lot of stress, not only Mateo, but also his aunt and the entire family are dealing with.
Thank you, Julian. So in addition to talking about the cultural considerations, we also wanted to touch on the legal implications for newcomer immigrant youth that are involved in the juvenile justice system. So a number of years ago, there really wasn't much awareness of the distinction between a juvenile adjudication of delinquency versus a criminal conviction as it pertained to applications for immigration relief. And over the years, there's been increased awareness and training on the technical differences here. This area of law is fairly complex, and we get into detail in the primer that you should all have access to. It's on pages 17 to 20 if you're looking for a very detailed description. But I wanted to at least provide kind of an overview here, which is that for purposes of federal immigration law, a juvenile adjudication of delinquency does not count as a criminal conviction, which is extremely helpful in many situations, but it's also really important to realize that these adjudications do have a number of implications. They could trigger conduct-based grounds of inadmissibility or deportability. Again, there's more details on that from pages 17 to 20 in the primer. And also, some forms of relief, of immigration relief, are completely discretionary. So an applicant could meet every single basis of requirements for qualifying for a particular visa or type of relief, but there is discretion that the government has in granting that relief. And so if there's information in the file that a child has been adjudicated delinquent, again, even though that doesn't count as a conviction, that could be used to deny a basis for relief. Also, for children that have been adjudicated delinquent, that can lead to them being stepped up to the secure facilities in the Office of Refugee Resettlement's network of placements where children are placed when they first arrive. There are plenty of children in secure facilities that haven't been adjudicated delinquent, but certainly with an adjudication, a child is much more likely to be placed in secure. The other thing that's important to note is that expungement, so the expunging of a juvenile adjudication, doesn't generally eliminate these immigration consequences. Next slide.
So let's get practical here. First of all, for Mateo, he's been in the process of applying for a special immigrant juvenile status, SIJS, when he was adjudicated delinquent for assault and battery and possession of marijuana. But based on this delinquency adjudication, Mateo became inadmissible for the immigration application, and he could no longer seek that status. He was not eligible for any other form of immigration relief. He was truly in a catch-22. When he was 19, 7 years later, 7 years after we first met him, he was picked up in an ICE aid, detained, and deported back to Honduras. And that's exactly what we do not want to have happen for these young men and women. So let's go on. What can we do? So let's get practical. We're now going to identify 6 basic steps that the juvenile justice system can do, and that we, who are the providers working in and with the juvenile justice system, can do on behalf of these youth. And let's go on and take them one at a time.
Okay, sorry about that. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
In order to make a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive decision, juvenile court judges must first ask themselves questions that facilitate this type of thinking. So for example, something like, have I taken into account what this youth might have had to do in order to cope to survive trauma in his home country en route to the U.S. and while adjusting to the life here? Have I considered the role trauma reminders, survival coping, and core stressors in resettlement might play in this youth's behavior? Have I considered the impact that my decision may have on placing the youth at risk for further trauma or for exacerbating his survival coping? Have I considered placements and services that will help this youth understand and overcome post-traumatic stress reactions and relinquish survival coping strategies? And something for us to be thinking about perhaps when we open up for questions and answers is, what types of questions do you all think probation officers, public defenders, and district attorneys can be asking? Next slide, please.
So the second tip is to support youth in strengthening protective factors and promoting resilience. So thinking back to the slide that I discussed earlier about resilience and protective factors. So for judges, but really for all players in the court system and even mental health professionals, identify the positive characteristics and abilities that that youth has and the relationships and supports in that child's life. And so thinking about Mateo, we learned that he's good at math, he enjoys spotting birds, and he's really good at drawing. So thinking about, trying to sort of get to what those positive characteristics and abilities are and what's important to that child. And as the judge, this information may not be readily apparent, but there are maybe ways to find those things out, such as ordering adjustment reports or asking probation officers to provide some evidence about a youth's strengths. And then pointing out a youth's positive characteristics and abilities both to the child themselves and also to other adults. And using court orders to obtain resources or services that can enhance and build upon those strengths. So for Mateo, could his skill at drawing be built into some of the services that are included in maybe a dispositional order, or services that probation could investigate for him as ways to help build upon that strength? And also things like educational support services. So for Mateo, we learned that he was struggling in school and particularly with the English language. So tutoring for English might be something that would be important to include in a dispositional order, as well as pro-social activities and ways that he can increase his sense of belongingness and connection.
When including mental health services as part of an order, it's really important to make every effort to specify that those services be delivered by a trauma-informed mental health professional and include trauma-specific, culturally congruent, evidence-based treatments that take into account the child's caregivers as well, when available. For example, the juvenile court can require that when possible, evaluation tools used as part of a psychological assessment are reliable and valid instruments for assessing the unique needs, challenges, and strengths of children within a particular ethnic group. It's also important to consider referrals to health and behavioral health services that specifically screen and assess one's trauma history and post-traumatic stress reactions, in addition to providing evidence-based culturally congruent services. Such treatments should be able to help the youth understand these post-traumatic stress reactions and how they can draw on their own resilience resources, including culturally specific ones, to overcome survival coping. Treatment should also be consistent with and honor the youth's culture and natural support systems. For example, children who grew up in rural areas may find increased relief or have greater capacity to regulate their emotions and behaviors when interacting with nature and animals, and therefore might benefit from something like animal-assisted therapy. Next slide, please. When possible, it's also important for juvenile court judges to make every effort to keep youth with their families and in their communities. Judges should rule out placements and referrals that are likely to exacerbate the youth's post-traumatic stress reactions and trigger survival coping by causing further separation from family. If the temporary out-of-home placement is truly necessary, it's important to consider the least restrictive alternative that supports resilience and does not re-traumatize or trigger post-traumatic stress reactions and survival coping for the youth. Juvenile court judges should also consider declining to order transfers to adult criminal court or facilities where youth are at high risk for re-traumatization. So again, question to be thinking about. Oh, next slide, please. That's okay. We'll jump forward given time.
So we need to think about ways we can increase the youth's engagement in the court process. For judges, it's really helpful to inquire whether the services ordered are actually provided and are meeting the youth's needs. It's also really makes such a difference when judges and other court officials, and also anyone who encounters youth in the juvenile justice system, shows a commitment to support the youth's efforts to rehabilitate by commenting affirmatively in court appearances and in evaluations about evidence that the youth is doing any of these following things: drawing on and strengthening his or her culture and positive characteristics and abilities, like Mateo with his drawings, his art; engaging responsibly in healthy and supportive relationship. That's Mateo beginning to build some peer relationships and being such a good brother and as much of a good nephew and son as he possibly can be. Making progress towards goals that are meaningful to the youth and the family, not just goals that are meaningful from the adult's outside perspective. But those do include things that are really crucial in terms of rehabilitation and community integration, like getting a job, attending school, and being involved in the family and in the community. It's also so crucial, and we can all do this, to honor the youth and her or his and the family's community culture, community and their community's cultural values and traditions. And finally, just noting the ways in which progress is being made so that it's actually a constructive commentary that follows that youth rather than one of labeling and blame. Next slide. And juvenile court can really provide amazingly enough positive experiences that counteract youth's historical and cultural and personal fears of government involvement and stigma, and can actually encourage youth to believe that there are adults who are there to help them, whom they can trust, who will follow through, who keep their promises, who actually help. And that might be possible not only in the juvenile justice system and in the courts and in detention or probation or diversion programs, but also in their schools, in the social and mental health services that they might actually benefit from. We just need to be thinking all of us are system players who can do this kind of work. And we need to include our colleagues such as probation officers and detention staff, as well as the more obvious folks like administrators, judges, and so forth. And moving on.
Great. So this is an example where all the different players have an important role in addressing this. So considering the negative immigration consequences of juvenile justice involvement. So everyone here, from the probation officer to the district attorney to the public defender to the judge, should ideally be thinking through these questions and considering the implications of a charging decision, of a violation of probation, of an adjudication, depending on their role in the process, and really considering how an adjudication might impact this youth's trajectory as it relates to their immigration status. Next slide.
So we certainly want to increase the capacity of the courts to serve immigrant children and families, and this involves definitely proactively developing relationships with community stakeholders. So consider pulling together a community focused on immigrant children that can evaluate the most effective and efficient way to increase the knowledge base of relevant stakeholders in the community and serve newcomer immigrant youth. And I see this as an exchange that the courts would also learn from the community, as well as provide knowledge and provide information to the community. So developing these relationships early and having a system in place, I think, is really important. also what services may be needed by the community. So having stakeholders involved with the judicial system, and I think this is at all levels. This is from law enforcement as well as, working with evaluators, working with judges. Having a system in place, they can assess what are the community needs, what is the knowledge that would be helpful to the community, and what can they learn from the community. And also assessing how the relevant stakeholders can collaborate more effectively in order to serve community immigrant youth. And so ultimately, the idea is to not rely on the most punitive aspects of the judicial system, but to find ways to provide a service and to increase safety in the community, as well as serve the youth who are have experiences of trauma and distress.
So with all this, we hope that this has been a very useful introduction. And for many of you, these are things that you already know very well, but I hope you've gained some perspective and feel some validation. This is all based upon two remarkable products that this very talented group of presenters and our colleagues have put together. One is a primer that Neha has mentioned, which is available, and they're both available on the internet. One is a primer for juvenile court judges, but I think you'll find that this is really a primer that can be useful for all of us from all backgrounds, whether we're legal professionals, mental health, child protection, juvenile justice. This is something that is really a guide, and it goes through the steps that we've talked about in much greater detail, as Neha has described. And for judges in particular, but also for any of us who have busy days, we've created a very brief bench card, 2 pages, so that it's everything that you need to know. And it's for judges, but again, we hope that it'll be a resource for any and all of us who are working with immigrant youth and their families in the juvenile justice and in other related systems. So we haven't quite come to the end of our time, and we would like to invite any questions from the audience. If you can just put those into our chat box, we would be glad to take any questions or comments at this point in time.
And Julian, maybe I can start by addressing one of the questions that came through earlier, which is how psychologists can work if there are barriers to directly partnering with ORR and CBP, which I absolutely acknowledge is the case. I will tell you that lawyers all over the country are hungry, so hungry for pro bono or low bono psychologists or psychiatrists or mental health professionals to work with their clients. I'm happy to connect folks depending on where they are geographically to the relevant legal service providers in your area, but we routinely, in order to apply for virtually any legal relief, having a psych eval done is often a really critical component of making the case. And so that's one way in which lawyers are always looking for assistance. And then, of course, just in general, being able to connect clients with mental health professionals that can address their ongoing trauma is something that lawyers express the need for all the time. So feel free to reach out to me. And I'm not sure if our contact information is on this, but we can certainly circulate this, our contact information after the presentation.
And you can find Neha at the National Center for Youth Law, which has a marvelous website describing their many accomplishments and the litigation that they're involved in now on behalf of many, many different youth families, including especially, in this case, immigrant families. I wonder if any of our other presenters who have such rich experience in working with both immigrant families and youth and working with youth and families who are involved in the juvenile justice system, any other thoughts you have about how you've been able to actually gain access to and develop alliances with both the immigration system and also the juvenile justice system?
This is Carly. I can't speak as much to the immigration system, but I do have a lot of experience working with juvenile justice stakeholders and the juvenile detention facilities. And I think, one of the things that's been helpful in sort of engaging kind of leadership in those spaces is to try to find ways to to get buy-in based upon things that will be helpful for them. So thinking about, addressing traumatic stress among youth in the system can help to maybe decrease, violent incidents in their facilities and make, increase the mental health capacity of the youth and also the staff that are working there. So trying to find ways to sort of tap into why this is important for them and the work that they do and how this can make their jobs easier can sometimes be a way in. And that's very challenging to do, but that is one thing that we found to be helpful.
Let me just add that I'm sorry, I just realized there's been a question from our audience that I think we really should give some attention to, maybe as a kind of a wrap-up, and that is from Maria Dominguez, and she asked, so what advances have been made in actually working effectively with the particular needs of LGBTQ youth, including the use of more inclusive and non-binary language? Panelists, any thoughts on that? Very important question. Well, it sounds like either we're on mute or we're still pondering that question, but we will make every effort to address that. It's clear that there are some special conditions. Maureen, would you like to join in?
I will. I think we have a long ways to go in terms of the materials and what's available to judges at this point. I think one of the things that we recognize, there's some studies, I think there was one study in California showing the percentage of adolescents, I think they were particularly looking at people who identify as female, who identify as a sexual minority or gender non-binary when they looked at the study. I think there's just a large percentage of youth who identify as LGBTQ, and that the system has not systematically started to address that yet. I feel like there's data that's just coming forward, and that the language of the materials that we've developed and that's been developing recently hasn't really sort of embraced the non-binary language, if that makes sense. I think we really point out that this is applicable to all youth who've been through the experiences of trauma. We're particularly focused on newcomer immigrant youth and the legal status questions that also can come up, but I would say that we still have a ways to go, Maria. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but we do have some ways to go with that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think we just have to acknowledge that this is a group and an area that we do need to pay more attention to, and just the use of they instead of he or she is a small beginning, but it's one that we're finally, I think, recognizing that is so crucial for youth and for adults who do not want to be identified in a binary fashion and who want their LGBTQ identity to be treated with respect. That could be an issue for Mateo. We just didn't happen to think of it in this case, and it certainly is an additional complication that we need to be sensitive to.
If I could add, Julian, if I could add that also, if you take a look at the primer, we don't offer to the judges a lot of information that is sort of, we know a lot in terms of race-based traumas and migration to the U.S. I think we point out in the core that, isolation, discrimination, those things are at play, but we really haven't, I think this is information to judges that we really want to be digestible. We haven't sort of extended the material to cover sort of a wide array of issues, other than pointing out that culture is a really important aspect that judges should consider.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank all the presenters.
Chime in. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I add one quick point in response to the question, Julian?
Certainly, and then we'll draw to a close.
Absolutely. Very quickly in response to that important question from Maria. Our team has done a lot of individual advocacy for children in ORR custody that are LGBTQ, and we have had to fight really hard. One of the most egregious cases that we were involved with was a trans youth who was placed in isolation for days on end essentially for being trans, and was told that it was for her protection. So we've gotten involved with a number of different individual situations, but we haven't done systemic advocacy on that kind of on that plane. And as Maureen acknowledged, it's certainly an area where there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Well summarized, and I want to thank all the panelists, and we in particular want to thank the youth and family members who have contributed their thoughts, and many of which were captured in the quotes as Neha described. We hope this has been useful to all of you, and we look forward to hearing from you and hope that we'll be able to find ways to work together on behalf of immigrant newcomer youth and their families, especially when they're involved in the juvenile justice system. Thanks, everyone.